So Cold Dot will be one of the strongest League Star archetypes for 3.20, and Elementalist is the ascendancy of choice for softcore trade. It is no longer a cultist, it is no longer champion, and definitely not a trickster. And it's basically because Elementalist has the best mix of AoE and damage that you can't get anywhere else. I think this is probably the most well-rounded build someone could play. It's really smooth, got a great clear, great playstyle. It can eventually tech and explodes with Legacy of Fury, has a very boss-friendly playstyle, and has all the right types of defenses to engage with modern Path of Exile. First things first, I want to talk about the config section. So because of next patch and buffs to hexes and how they affect bosses, we no longer tick off Guardian Pinnacle bosses. We just use this no over here. We manually write in resistances, and then we lower the levels of our curses down to 15, I think. And this simulates the buffs to curses, while also keeping the boss resistances relatively high, but without the boss curse penalty that we currently have in 3.19. So now going on to the tree. Elementalist, as opposed to Cultist, is the key debate that happens a lot of times. So a Cultist is really great in events like Endless Delve, where Enfeeble has really high value. Enfeeble is still really strong, and you'll get that with a +1 from a Cultist. And you have Explodes, but Elementalist actually has better clear as well, can get Explodes off Obliteration or Legacy of Fury, and actually has way more damage. I think roughly in the range of about 20% more damage, just from clicking these nodes, because of how effective ailment scaling is with Shaper of Storms, and you also have really great defensive boosts from Bastion of Elements, something you have to take on this build because there's just nothing else to take. The tree I use is also fairly unconventional, and that's just because I want easy access to spell suppression. I path all the way down here to Magebane, but this tree is actually really fantastic. You can see over here, I need a total of 4 dexterity. 4. To be able to cap all my attributes at 155, and then I can use any skill in the game, and that's really fantastic. You don't have those problems early. And I am taking practical application because this is just a really high value node. I've seen Ben take this on his D runs all the way to the end game. Otherwise though, the tree should be fairly standard. I don't think running a cluster jewel is worth it, so I think this sort of tree will be really worth it at all times. Damage over time, cold damage, ailment scaling, damage over time multi over here, 2 suppression areas. And one thing to note is that you do have some extra space for suppression off these small nodes. They're relatively high value, so if you just want a suppression cap early, that's something you can do. I'm also going for 3 separate aura setups. And the reason I go for these 3 things is because I run a lot of auras because of Divine Diadem. I'm taking this extra node here because this simulates the 4 nodes you have taken for +1 curse on the new tree. And this is probably the biggest new thing that a lot of builds will be running. Dual curse, especially for running hexes, is really powerful. The gear is relatively easy to get. I wouldn't actually multi-mod this +1 scepter, but if I had something like +1 and cast speed, then I would go in multi-mod. But a weapon like this is really realistic for like day 2. The shield is by far the most optimistic piece of gear. Increased damage isn't that easy to get, but I just want to show you what you're looking for. Benchcraft suppression is really great. I would never skip the +1. A +1 shield is super easy to access. Divine Diadem is my helmet of choice, lets you run a bunch of auras, really great with aura scaling. And then I'm running, just a rare chest early on, PDR, suppression, life, or effect implicits. You might go for hatred implicit, maybe determination implicit as well. But Skin of the Lords overtakes this in the game. Gloves, you're looking for cold dot multi and cold exposure. The exposure in particular is really strong, but I'm also using an essence of horror on these gloves, ideally to get 30% more damage for your cold snap setup, which goes in your gloves. You don't need to do this. Probably not something that's going to happen really early in the game, but something you want to look for in the early mid-game. Boots, the most important thing to get is Scorched Ground Implicit. If you can't get this implicit, you can also use Legacy of Fury, which is the Maven boots. If I start with Cold Dot, this is something I'm going to use while I'm mapping the whole time. The Explodes feel really good on Elementalist because this node gives you 60% generic AoE, which does apply to the explosions. On the Amulet, you're looking for +1. You're also looking for damage over time multi if possible, life. And then you want a Benchcraft effect on non-damaging ailments. Really strong, scales your Bone Chill, scales your Shock, scales your Scorch too. On the rings, I have Min Frenzy. I actually probably would rather go Min Endurance because you generally have Frenzy uptime because of Cold Snap, Vol, Cold Snap. Just need to fix that POB. And then on the belt, this regen mod is really great for running Eldritch Battery early. Now, once you get to around 1k ES, depending on what your gear looks like, you probably don't need this suffix. But early on, the suffix will really help sustain your ES. Now, just play it by ear. If you don't need it, you don't need it. Flats are standard, and then I'm running 1 single 2-prop jewel. So you can see fairly straightforward SF gear. Basically, life, suppression, resists, Diadem. Target farmable, really great. And then multi-mod. The skill gem setup is also fairly well known at this point. Creeping Frost and Vortex go in a 6 link or in a 4 or 5 link. Basically your main links. And this gets linked to Control Destruction, Swift, Hypo, and LE Focus. LE Focus is okay here for 2 reasons. Firstly, your chill ground will still apply chill, and secondly, you still have another chilling setup from your cold snap setup, and this in your gloves with efficacy, bone chill, and control destruction. The key point of contention here is efficacy. I value this over every other support for this setup. I think skill effect duration is really great here, not only because Cold Snap consumes frenzy charges if you don't wait for the cooldown, but also because Vol Cold Snap with duration feels really nice while you're mapping. In my diet, I'm running Determ, Grace, Malevolence, and Tempest Shield. This gives us damage, defenses, shock immunity, which is really great. And Malevolence also gives us a little more skill effect duration, scaling that VCS even more. Because I'm using Diadem, I get a free Divine Blessing. I'm using Hatred. You can also use Zealotry. The Consecrated Gun uptime is not that great, though, because of, running Control Destruction. So Hatred is probably what you're going to be going for here. If you were really lazy, you could switch out Malevolence for Purity of Elements and then run Malevolence as your Divine Blessing. I don't think Purity of Elements is actually good on this build. I think it's good on very, very, very few builds. I've got a dual curse setup and Defiant Spanner over here, and then Shield Charge with faster attacks, casting damage taking Molten Shell, and this Primal Aegis is coming from the Elementalist Ascendancy. In terms of leveling, I don't actually know for sure. So generally, I would tend to go actually Strange Cold Dot leveling right away. At level 12, you can grab Wintertide Brand and Creeping Frost. I would tend to prioritize right-sided nodes and go over here, grabbing Dot Multi, grabbing this resistance stuff, and maybe even going for Fingers of Frost early. The stuff down here is really strong. Trickery and also Coordination for not only attack speed, but just based on attributes. And LE Focus and Skill Effect Duration is really strong. After this, I'd probably go towards the right side now, grabbing this stuff, grabbing some res, and taking the aura cluster, especially as you start getting towards Act 6 and 7, where you start wanting to run a lot more of your auras. Filling out the rest of the tree should be fairly straightforward. Just get damage when you can, get suppression when you get to maps. Ascendancy nodes, I personally believe Shaper of Storms might be the best early node to take. Mastermind of Discord is really good, but exposure is a bit awkward to apply while you're doing campaign, and having good campaign damage is important to make sure your XP stays up the whole time. I would, however, go for Mastermind and Hard Destruction next, and then saving Bastion for last, because honestly, if you die in Softcore, you die anyway. It's not a squishy build, it should be fine. If you want more leveling details, you can go to Balar. I've linked his video in the description for cold dot leveling. His was for an occultist. He doesn't really play past Act 10 mostly, but he has a really, really great overview and some raw gameplay of what leveling on cold dot could look like. All in all, though, I think this build should be fairly straightforward to follow. It's a fantastic setup, and going Elementalist is what I believe to be strictly better on softcore trade than any other Ascendancy. Trickster is a little bit faster and a little bit more defensive. Champ is far more defensive, and Occultist pretty much just has cosmetic explosions. Elementalist has the best damage, it has really solid types of defenses, and has fantastic clear speed because of great AoE. And honestly, the more I look at this build, the less I think that I'm going to league start with Poison Seismic Sabo. But I guess we'll see come Friday.